Welcome, welcome to the Ashby Village Science and Ideas Group. My name is Joe Evinger, and I coordinate this group's events with the help of our co-host and tech expert, Hillary Naylor. All of our members here are very educational and work experience. We all share a common interest in science and new ideas. We currently have over 60 members in our group and another 100 or so on our guest list. We meet via Zoom the second Thursday of every month from 3 o'clock until around 4:30. We have a different guest speaker each month who talks on a topic related to science and ideas. We rely on our science and ideas members, Ashby Village members, invitees, presenters, and others for ideas about new speakers and ways to connect with them. Later this year, we have some speakers who will talk on the following topics. In October, Alicia Welsh will speak to us on conservation of vultures in the world. November 9th, there'll be a presentation by Richard Schwartz, whose research is focused on understanding the mechanism by which growth is both enabled and contained in our bodies. Particular emphasis may be on knees. On December 14th, Irene Kuhn will return to give us a new talk on progress in the field of cancer vaccines. Also for next year, I'm actively looking for speakers to talk to us about artificial intelligence or AI, and also about satellite imaging and what the satellites can show us and what they can't. We invite all Ashby Village members to join our group. Others interested in Ashby Village and our presentations are also welcome. A quick commercial: Ashby Village is a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit organization. I asked Hillary to place a link to the Ashby Village website in the chat. As a note to our guests, please consider a donation or even joining our organization. Special thanks to Hillary this time for recommending finding today's speakers. And Sarah Evinger now is going to present Charles Tart. Sarah?
Today's presenter is Charley Tart. He was born in Pennsylvania and is a renowned psychologist and consciousness researcher known for his contributions to transpersonal psychology and parapsychology. He has a PhD in psychology from the University of North Carolina and focused on studying altered states of consciousness, including meditation and the use of psychedelics. His work extended into parapsychology, where he conducted scientific experiments to explore and validate phenomena like ESP and telepathy. His writings and teaching have inspired many to explore their own consciousness and embrace a holistic perspective on human experience. Through his rigorous approach and open-mindedness, he has become an influential figure in the field of psychology and parapsychology, expanding our understanding of consciousness and the human potential. Take it away, Charley.
I always squirm when I get introduced because I thought that's much too much. So, did anybody look up the date that I put in the description of this talk? If you did, raise your real hand. Nobody did. Okay, I'll tell you about what that date is about in a while. I'm retired, supposedly. I'm still very active in a lot of ways, but I don't teach anymore. And also, being retired, I'm not subjected to the pressures that happen in an academic environment. And believe me, when you show an interest in parapsychology, much less doing experiments that show that there is something happening there, you get in trouble. People don't like that. So I'm free of that now. I'm retired. They can't get rid of me. So I want to start this by telling you about a personal story. I live up in North Berkeley, near the Ashby Village office, actually. And back in 1973, I did something which was a rare treat. Those of us who were interested in consciousness, what people actually experience, were quite rare in psychology. Psychology had bought into behavior because it's easier to measure and behavior is real, it's worth studying, but to think of it exclusively and ignore experience is, you miss all sorts of important things. There was a conference in Kansas. Dorothy and Toto weren't there, but can't have everything. There was a conference on consciousness and people's various experiments in doing that, and some talked about meditation. And that included a young psychologist who'd actually spent almost a year in India, where he'd actually been taught meditation techniques by some of the gurus there who teach that sort of thing. And I was very interested in talking to him, because most of us here in the West who talked about meditation back then, we were strictly intellectuals. We didn't really know what went on. So I didn't get enough chance to talk to this fellow. I'll protect his identity by calling him Dr. X. When Dr. X was going to be coming out to Berkeley for some business, he let me know. And I said, fine, let's meet. We'll go out and get some coffee, and I want to talk to you about meditation and stuff. So he came out. It was in February 4th, 1974. He was staying at a friend's house at the south end of Berkeley. I live here in the north end. And I was to meet him at 8 o'clock. So I was driving over there down San Pablo Avenue. Now, as I said, I'm an old-fashioned kind of psychologist, though. I'm interested in consciousness, and I have a consciousness I carry with me all the time. It's handy to make observations. As I was driving down San Pablo Avenue to get that end of the time, things got funnier and funnier for me. I got very worried. I got afraid. And I got so afraid that I was going to be shot or beaten up or something like that when I got to the southern part of Berkeley there, that 3 times I pulled over getting ready to make a U-turn. Now, part of my mind was being a nice clinical psychologist and saying, passed for normal all these years, but clearly quite paranoid and maybe having a schizophrenic break at this particular time. Another part of me, which has been conditioned to be a tough, stereotypical man, was so ashamed that I was feeling afraid, really. But I couldn't turn around. That would just be such a dishonorable thing to do. So I went over, found a parking place near where Dr. X was staying. And he had told me that he would be out front because some people were holding a meeting in the front of the house, and I could pick him up there. So I walked around past a number of parked cars and so forth, and he was out front. So we said hello, and we went off back to my car and went over to a restaurant where we could have some coffee and talk comfortably. I did not tell him that I almost had a psychotic break on the way over here. I mean, we were just getting acquainted. And I'm supposed to be a solid, stable kind of person. And I basically talked to nobody about that. I tried to forget about it very soon. It didn't fit with my own idea of being a sensible person. Well, a few weeks later, I got a letter from Dr. X, and after some conventional stuff dating to the material we had talked about, he said, incidentally, did you know, just a little while after you picked me up, I was very glad you picked me up because I was feeling afraid standing out on the street there, and I was very glad you took us away. And incidentally, they kidnapped Patty Hearst a few doors down the street. There were people beating people up, shooting at them, cyanide tipped bullets, all sorts of stuff. The Symbionese Liberation Army. If they were sitting in their car getting ready to go in and grab her, I probably walked right past them. So I was reassured in some sense. I guess I wasn't going crazy. Some part of me was sensing there was a lot of danger in the place I was going to. Now, a lot of people would say that's a psychic experience, and I'm pretty happy calling it a psychic experience myself. You know, I never talk about the ultimate nature of anything on the basis of one experience. But that was so unlike the way my mind works. I don't go into panics for nothing at all, or even with something. I generally don't go into panics. Anyway, I had been, I had gotten so afraid, Dr. X had gotten so afraid, and all that violence had gone on just right down the street from where I picked him up. That got my attention. I don't think of myself as a person who's psychic, okay? I have a few ordinary psychic experiences once in a while in my life, but that was so dramatic. Now, here's where it got interesting later. Not too long after, yeah. Is somebody saying something to me or?
No, continue.
Oh, okay. It's not that I'm hearing voices. I think it's coming
No,
through the computer system.
no, we heard it too.
A few months after that, I was asked to become a consultant on a project at Stanford Research Institute that was investigating something called remote viewing. And remote viewing was a deliberate term picked to avoid the woo-woo effect, okay? The two people at that time doing the investigations were both physicists, and physicists are allowed to do all sorts of weird stuff because they're real scientists, not like us psychologists and anthropologists and sociologists and all us people, you know, they're the real people. They can get away with it. But still, they knew they'd have a hard time getting support for their research if they said, we want to do ESP research. So they called it remote viewing, which was a popular engineering buzzword at that time for developing systems that could detect things at a distance, radar that could work over the horizon, for instance, and the like. Except they were using some people who were picked for talent at doing this, where they would sit them down in a room where they had no information about what they were supposed to look at, except they'd be told, the guy you met earlier has now gone someplace. Where he went was determined by a random number generator that led him to a set of driving instructions, and only he knows where he was going. All you can guess about him logically is that he's within a 20-minute drive of Stanford Research Institute. Well, that narrows it down to a couple of million places right away. So you don't have to worry about accidentally guessing at things. They had people who did this extremely well, enough so that they got attention from some of the intelligence agencies in the government. One of these was the CIA, and at one point, a person who worked for the CIA came out to investigate what they were doing, and he thought it was probably a lot of hokum. But they showed him some examples of past remote viewings and the like, and particularly, they finally had one of their remote viewers do one for him. And they told him, give us a target, something to focus this guy in on. So he gave them, what do you call the coordinates that map the Earth? Geographical coordinates? Before everybody had this on their iPhone, you know. They just told him something like 24, 37, 92 west, east, wouldn't mean a thing to the vast majority of us. And tell us what's there. It turns out these were the coordinates of a little log cabin this guy had back in the mountains back east. So the remote viewer successfully described the log cabin, but you know, a lot of log cabins look like other log cabins, even though he didn't know it was a log cabin. But then the remote viewer said, but there's something really interesting around the other side of the hill here. I want to go look at that. And he then described a secret government installation that was used for intelligence purposes. It included describing things like the names in some file folders that were on a desk inside this secure facility. That got the attention of the CIA. In fact, it resulted in congressional investigations and hearings sometimes later because some congressmen were considered there had been a very bad security leak, that anybody could know that that place was there, much less what was inside it. Anyway, bottom line, to be a I wanted to be a consultant to this remote viewing stuff because they were getting strong ESP, not the little bit statistically significant but practically trivial stuff you get when you work with the standard college sophomore. They're getting good stuff. And also, I had some experience in judging things that would be helpful in analysis of their stuff. To be a consultant, I had to get a top secret clearance. And even with this top secret clearance, I was only told about some of the practical applications they had done because the others were all for your eyes only. That's why I use that. If I told you, I'd have to kill you. Except I'm only talking about stuff that is now going into the open literature. So I'm not giving away any secrets. What was the example I was going to give? Slipped out of my mind. Okay. Look at the note I made myself to not get. Yeah. Oh, yes. One other thing. It turned out that they had been doing this remote viewing work back at the same time I'd had my experience with Patty Hearst being kidnapped. And the Berkeley police were desperate enough, and somebody there knew somebody who had heard of this remote viewing thing, that they asked this, I forget whether it was the same, yeah, I think it was the same day, they asked for a remote viewing of what went on. Where was Patty Hearst being taken to? The remote viewer described a little place you could pull off on the freeway that wasn't obvious. The police thought, oh, well, we shouldn't ask this whoa-whoa stuff. Everybody escapes on the freeway, big deal. But a day later, they went there anyway, and they found the getaway car that the Symbionese Liberation Army had used to kidnap Patty Hearst. If they'd gone there at the time they got the remote viewing information, they might have actually caught them. But instead, we had years of interesting stuff. Okay. For a US government agency to say they're reporting stuff with psychics, thank God we're calling them remote viewers so we don't use that word psychics, that they're using ESP, no, they're using an unknown cognitive faculty of some sort or another. Use the right words so that the bad words don't immediately get people uptight. They were given many practical tasking operations by something like 19 or 20 different intelligence agencies over the years. That included things like the Coast Guard asking them, where is a certain boat carrying in a big shipment of drugs? And they found it. What happened with the Chinese A-bomb test? They saw it before any word came out to the West, it failed. For these agencies to do that with the wickedness, no, not wickedness, with the jealousy and greed in Washington to try to get the money for your stuff and not have the other people get it. So you say they're just doing this woo-woo stuff. That's telling you in a very indirect way that they're getting pretty good results applying remote viewing. Okay, that's the main thing I wanted to tell you, except you probably want to know, how do you do remote viewing? As near as I can follow it, and I watched a number of sessions and whatnot, you first impress the person you hope is a remote viewer with previous successes. And it helps if you're a PhD physicist to start that, because then, you're close to God and what you say is very, very authoritative. And that's what they routinely did at SRI, showing past sort of things here. Then they take the person off into a laboratory room, no windows, lock the place. They had already introduced him to the other half of the research team. And as I said before, that person then goes to a random number generator, picks some driving instructions, and goes off somewhere, stays there and does the appropriate thing for being at that site. If the remote viewing target, for instance, happens to be a church, they pray for the success of the experiment. If the remote viewing target happens to be a playground, they play on the swings or the merry-go-rounds. Uh, and the remote viewer ends up saying things like something swinging back and forth and squeaking as it does, while the traveler who was out there was swinging on the swings and it was going squeak, 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 because swings often do and whatnot. Probably about, well, no, the way they did it, they said they got some degree of remote viewing beyond guessing with almost everybody they tried this with, but they tried it with a very limited set of people. They did not try it with college sophomores. They tried it with middle career people who've been very successful at what they did and were used to being successful with new things, so they could take this as a challenge. If you'd have them do it again, a lot of them don't do too well the second time around, but eventually you find some people who are pretty consistent in doing that kind of stuff. I just finished reading a book by one of the best remote viewers who was ever around. Can you see this now? This is by Joseph McMahon, who was probably the best remote viewer this country ever had. And this is the story of how he became a psychic spy, basically. Fascinating reading. Fascinating reading. Or another excellent book that tells the story, especially of that early remote viewing days, was by one of the physicists, Russell Targ, T-A-R-G, called Eye Spies. A lot of examples of excellent remote viewing in there. What does this mean? Let me just jump now to a more speculative kind of thing, okay? It doesn't mean my religion is right and everybody else is wrong, but it does mean when religions talk about miracles, quote unquote, they may be talking about psychic functioning, whether it's just a basic human talent or whether there are some sort of spiritual beings involved. Oh, that question is way beyond my pay grade at this point. Although I think we can get a little bit better fix on it with enough research. But I think this is the implications of extrasensory perception and this remote viewing form of extrasensory perception are very important, because most people nowadays buy well, no, I don't want to say most people, I take that back. The official view of reality, supposedly scientifically proven, is that it's all materialistic. You've got these atoms, which used to be solid little things, and now they're bundles of probability or whatnot. They bump into each other. You do that over a zillion years, and you get us, and it's all by chance. And there's no real meaning to it. We hang around as biological organisms for a while, which somehow produces consciousness, and nobody has the slightest idea how biological stuff can produce consciousness, and then you die. End of story. That could be true, but there's also a lot of evidence. I put the evidence in quotes down because it's trickier to evaluate than something like remote viewing, that suggests that maybe we survive death in some way, that maybe there is some kind of spiritual reality. Nobody's going to run out and form a church on this. Oh, well, somebody will. I mean, somebody will figure out how to make money out of it. And some people have applauded viewing to make money on the stock market, incidentally. But the point I want to say is that if you think that everything being a meaningless accident, it's all just material with no meaning, doesn't run. Stuff is material, okay? The last book I wrote, I gave it the title, The End of Materialism. And that's a very accurate title. it should have been longer. It should have been the end of dogmatic materialism or overextended materialism or something like that, to simply show that there's aspects of reality that need to be investigated and not just swept under the table. There's an amusing story behind that too. I think I goofed on the title, okay? The publishers wanted a title that was interesting. But I think when people saw a title like The End of Materialism, a lot of them thought, I guess that's a book on philosophy, and philosophy puts you to sleep real fast. So when friends finally persuaded me to put it into a paperback, and I was already retired, so I didn't have to worry about blowback at the academic level, I basically put the book out in paperback as The Secret Science of the Soul. Whoa, boy, well, I've gotten in trouble if I had used that title while I was still actively teaching and the like. And I could tell you a lot of horror stories about the academic life, and some of you know them all too well. Okay, that's the basic introduction I wanted to give. I've been investigating aspects of extrasensory perception, altered states of consciousness, stuff like that, throughout my whole career. I'm happy to answer various questions about whatever aspects of it you guys are thinking about. So you can raise your virtual hands. I suppose you could actually raise your actual hand and be noticed, or something like that. Sarah, you're doing it. You have to unmute yourself.
There we are.
There we go.
Charley, I have one very direct question right off, and that is, what is the soul to you? It has many connotations.
Well, in my most academic and scientific personification, the soul to me is a term we use for something we don't understand worth a darn, but it has something to do that seems to have properties beyond what we would expect from the way material stuff works. Okay?
Yep, I'm with you.
When my wife died a year ago, or when my cat died a week ago, I pray for their souls. I don't know exactly who or what I'm praying to, but I hope there's something that goes on, but I don't know. I try to see my various beliefs as tools and find the right tool for the job that I'm faced with. So, if somebody's died or worried about dying, I'm not going to tell them about the statistical significance of some of these tests or so forth. So I snuck out of that pretty good, didn't I?
I thought so.
What did you want me to say, Sarah?
I wanted you to say what you just said, because I love the mixture of science with some words like the soul. When you talk dogmatic materialism, that seems to be a very concrete concept that we can all kind of agree on. Whereas when you get into this other, which makes me want to read your book, I'm a little more curious to see where you go with it.
The main thing I feel competent to go with it is to say that while it's an unknown area, it's really important because it has to do with the kind of meaning a lot of people have in life. I've known of too many people who, say, what, this is just an accident of molecules bumping into each other and then we die? Is that the whole story? And, and then people going to the other extreme of desperately clinging to some particular religion because it makes them feel better. That's okay. If it helps somebody function better, that's fine. But I think we could get a little clarification on what is and isn't. I'll give you a better answer. A friend of mine was named Robert Monroe. He wrote several books starting with one called Journeys Out of the Body. He had gone to sleep one night and he woke up and thought he must be sleepwalking, and he was standing at the wall and there was this funny round thing on the wall in front of him. What in the world was going on? And he woke up more and it was a light fixture. and people don't build light fixtures on the walls, so they put them on the ceiling. And then he turned over and looked down, and there was his wife in bed, and there was some man in bed with her, and he looked kind of dead. He wasn't sure he liked that at all, but that began the series of, oh gosh, 30 years or so of frequently finding himself out of the body at night, and even sometimes being taken to school at someplace else. And this was especially interesting to me because of my interest in altered states of consciousness. We think there's one way to reason. You can be logical and right, or you can be confused and wrong. The nature of reasoning changes. And I've talked about this as state-specific logic. I think I've managed to put that term into the literature now. And I used to ask Bob, well, what did you learn in school?
Charlie, you're breaking up a bit. Maybe your internet
Through that, I got
connection
a
might
little
be a bit
bit-
wobbly.
Yes, I don't know how to make my internet connection be
Yeah,
more
it's
stable.
cleared now. It's probably a temporary thing.
Could you
Yeah.
repeat the last two or three sentences, Charlie? You were frozen.
You were talking about this.
So meeting a guide. Okay, how's our reception?
It's good.
see how
You were
very
talking about state-specific
well.
logic. And it-
Yeah. Okay, state-specific logic. You're in love. Your beloved says something which is so wonderful and sweet. Somebody else hears it, and they're babbling, but that doesn't have any meaning. Being in love is an altered state of consciousness for a lot of people. Okay? You're depressed. When I get really sad, when I look around, this is a crappy world we live in. And I can see, what's this shoddy crumpled up paper on my desk here, and that crap on the floor. The mood you're in is an altered state of consciousness for a lot of people. It's a little tricky because it depends on the intensity too. You can be a little bit depressed and still think quite normally and perceive quite normally, but it'll get strong enough, it kind of takes over the control of your perceptual apparatus. So what I was saying was Bob Monroe told me eventually he was being taught stuff that was state specific. When he was in the state of perceiving himself as out of his body, he remembered what he'd been taught in previous lessons, and he understood the new lessons. When he come back to his body, it was all mush. I don't have any meters to put on the bedside beside tell me where he really went, but he was a very honest man trying his best to describe this strange stuff that was happening to him. So how did we get to this particular place? You asked me about the soul, okay?
Right.
Maybe somebody like Bob Monroe, who has frequent out of the body experiences, is telling us something about a soul. I also was fortunate years ago in meeting a young woman. She was our babysitter, okay? And she learned that it was okay to talk about funny stuff around me and my wife. We wouldn't look at her like she was crazy. And it turns out she had had the experience of coming out of her body almost every night when she was a child. She thought that was normal. I mean, you go to bed, you fall asleep, you maybe have a dream, then you wake up floating near the ceiling, look at yourself in bed, then you fall back asleep. That's how everybody experiences sleep, isn't it? Well, after she talked about it to a few of her child friends, she learned to keep her mouth shut. That was on it. And I do have to say that when you do surveys, just about every survey that's ever been done of people, have they personally had some kind of psychic experience, it's always more than 50% saying yes. And that's probably underreporting because there's a certain taboo on this. You know, you don't talk about stuff that some people are liable to think means you're crazy. So the bias is for underreporting. Somebody else. Naomi, I can see her actual hand. You got to unmute yourself. Good.
I did, yeah. I have two questions. One leads into the other. The first question is about culture. Now, we as Westerners, our worldview, scientific worldview, is one among many other cultures' worldviews.
Mhm.
And a lot of other cultures incorporate things which we think as woo, you know, what you said was that. So
Technical term.
yeah, technical term, yeah. So so I think, you know, that kind of thing, it's not just like there's one science, there's different sciences, but, and here's the second question, you know, if once you start, and I think that's one of the reasons maybe for not wanting to go that way, in that direction, is because once you start, people think it's like a slippery slope. There's all these charlatans who are gonna find, oh, and there are already charlatans. Yeah, I'm a fortune teller. I can tell what I'm psychic. I can tell what's going to happen. I can speak to your dead mother and stuff like that. So that's the other issue.
He wants me to contribute for you to contribute a lot of money to my foundation.
Mm.
Yeah. The charlatanism that goes along with this is a real problem. You can get influence and power over a lot of people by faking psychic abilities, and it's just the way people are. What to do about it? Once in a while, you get people who expose some of these charlatans, but there's so much desire for it that it never goes away, okay? Because see, the way I want to take your question is some people start developing psychic abilities and it scares them. What in the world is happening to me? This is crazy what's happening. I can't be floating near the ceiling. I can't know that that plane's going to crash tomorrow and the plane crashes or something. And that worries enough people that I think that that is an unrecognized cause of mental illness for some people. Our culture does not provide any support for that, except you're nuts. You need medication or a nice long vacation in an asylum or something like that. Whereas some other cultures who are more familiar with that kind of stuff might say, oh, you're having dreams that come true. You might have the abilities to become a shaman with a little training. Let's take you to a shaman school and see what kind of talent is there. That would be a sensible and civilized way to handle this, but our culture is not doing that. And of course, in cultures like that, you have some control over charlatans, okay? The shamans have to get results. If they can't find the lost cow that wandered off, and the lost cow is 90% of your wealth, they don't stay in business for a long time. I'll tell you a funny story. A friend of mine is an anthropologist, and he spent a lot of times with various Indian tribes in South America. He was studying the shamans. He was really interested in that kind of thing. And he once got into a discussion with a group of shamans, and they asked him, how do Westerners understand some of the things that shamans do? Like putting a curse on somebody so they get sick and die or something like that. So he gave them a long lecture on psychosomatic medicine. And before he finished, he could not understand why all these shamans were rolling around on the floor laughing. They thought this was the craziest idea they ever heard of. And finally, they explained, oh, yeah, and the psychosomatic medicine idea is you know that you've been cursed and that affects your psychology, and then that things get worse for ordinary psychological reasons. But the shaman said, look, if you know somebody's cursed you, you'll get another shaman to get rid of the curse, and it won't work. When you curse somebody, they never tell them. You Westerners have the strangest beliefs. We don't have a very good cultural openness yet to. Sure, other cultures have some ideas that are probably wrong, just like we do, but we shouldn't throw everything out just because we think we're so superior. And that's a hard one to get away with because it's so conditioned into us from childhood on. I got into a terrible argument with my granddaughter a few months ago because I mentioned someone was a man who did such and such, and I got a long lecture on gender pronouns and how politically incorrect I was being. I said, I'm 86 years old. I'm used to talking that way. I'm sorry. I think she's eventually forgiven me as a helpless case, but culture is a great blessing and a great curse. It narrows us down for better and worse. Science, if it's used properly, can help us get out of it. Not that I say science is the only way, but science does have this rule that every time you think you understand, can explain things, that's your best working explanation for now, but it doesn't mean the subject is closed. It's always open to more investigation. And that can open up a lot of stuff, which people hate because they want to think they know everything that's important, and so they're superior. Good culture question. What is the ding dong I keep hearing, Sarah? Is that other people clicking in?
It's that, and also I just raised my hand here,
Okay.
and
Alan, you raised your hand, I think.
yeah. So
I don't know if I raised my hand, but I clicked on to unmute so I could ask a question.
Okay, good.
Should I go ahead?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Well, considering how our culture views these abnormal types of experiences, can you comment on the legal system? Any famous cases or how are if things go badly, say, or someone thinks they're going badly, how do these things wind up before judges?
I don't have the slightest idea.
Oh.
That's a very interesting question, but I don't really know. I think there have been a very few cases in the past couple hundred years where testimony from a spirit medium has tried to be introduced into court or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether it was or not. And I think it was only recently that in Britain they repealed the Witchcraft Act. That's my phone. I don't need that. Okay. I'm sorry, you got me on that one.
Oh, well, I thought you might know of someone who got in trouble and whether they were completely discredited, legally speaking. I fear that might happen, and another reason that people would shy away from describing their experiences.
Well, yeah, I'm sure, for instance, if someone said, I did this because my spirit guides told me to do it, and that's my excuse, that would not fly well in the legal system.
Mm-hmm.
Bring your spirit guide onto the witness chair, please, to get direct testimony.
They might call you up for expert witness in a situation like that. Yeah.
Good question. Well,
thank you.
I know.
Greg had his hand up. Is that
Hi,
the question,
Charley.
Greg?
Hi, Greg.
Hi there. I wanted you to talk about your personal evolution that led you to go from studying telepathy and precognition in laboratories to your involvement with the Gurdjieff work and the concept of waking up? What was that trajectory for you?
Oh, that was a very roundabout and intertwined trajectory, okay? I have always devoted some of my time to studying things like telepathy, okay? I have not deliberately studied precognition. Precognition is where you're asked to describe the qualities of things that don't exist yet. Okay, the standard laboratory test for it back in the classical days was you would tell someone, you see this deck of cards and they're either red or black. After an hour after you leave here, I'm going to shuffle it in this shuffling machine 50 times. But would you please write down now what the order of the deck of cards would be? Sometimes, often enough, it's statistically significant to show that the mind can somehow get information from the future. That makes so little sense to me that I can mention that the evidence is there, but I've never deliberately attempted to study it because I don't know what I would do with it. I'm old-fashioned. I'd like time to just kind of move along. But then I read stuff that physicists are talking about, and something like precognition, that's small stuff compared to some of the stuff physicists talk about. How it led into the Gurdjieff work. The Gurdjieff work is a meditation or mindfulness system that says, I'm translating into modern psychological terminology, that says we suffer a lot because we're walking around in a dream. We think we're accurately seeing the world as it is, right? There's a door over there, there's a window over there, there's a person whose looks I don't like over there or something. But in point of fact, the construction of our perception is affected by our beliefs, our previous experiences, traumas we've had and the like, and we can badly misperceive what is actually around us. Our logic of it in that case can then be seriously twisted. So we suffer a lot, and it's unnecessary suffering. If I keep banging my head against the wall because I'm convinced there's a door there when there isn't, and I keep going bang against the plaster, hopefully I'll eventually learn that my map of the world is not very good. A lot of spiritual systems that have some kind of meditation training, and believe me, meditation is such a vaguely defined word that I would like to prohibit it being used in the English language, but I'll have no luck with that. But a lot of them have, I'll call it mind training systems that teach you to try to observe some of the ways your mind is twisting things and misperceiving things instead of just taking stuff for granted. G.I. Gurdjieff was an Easterner who was one of the first people to try to take Indian yogi systems and other systems and make them practical for Westerners. So he came up with stuff to try to make you more aware of where you are at the present moment. It's different from the usual meditation systems where they require you to sit in a cross-legged posture and do special things, okay? I tried meditation practices for years and eventually gave up because it was quite clear to me that meditation calls for some special talent that I guess I don't have. Once I finally found a teacher who, this was a man named Shinzen Young, who taught me some meditation that actually worked, I realized that every meditation technique I'd been taught before, often by distinguished Eastern teachers who were really good, always started with the instructions, first, clear your mind so you're not thinking. Oh yeah, I'm clearing my mind. Oh no, I can't tell myself I'm clearing my mind because then it's not clearing. So I got to, well, there must be a better way to do that. My mind is not clear. That kind of meditation, I think I wasted an enormous amount of time on. But on the kinds that works from Gurdjieff's approach or from, say, the Vipassana approach in Buddhism, where in everyday life you try to bring more mindfulness to it, that's useful. I don't know what it does, if anything, for me spiritually, but I'm not as stupid as I used to be. I don't misinterpret things anywhere near as badly. There are, probably a dozen or 2 dozen published experiments now that show that meditators generally do better in ESP tests also. But I take that finding as very preliminary because in the first place, they defined a meditator as somebody who'd been given instructions on how to meditate and then made to sit still for half an hour. Come on, folks, you got to find out what they actually did before you call them a meditator and stuff. So, our knowledge there is still very crude. But traditions like the yoga systems say that if you got very good at certain kinds of meditation, you would develop psychic abilities. And you better be real careful if you develop them, because they can go right to your ego. I'm psychic, not like these ordinary dummies around me. I know what they really want. No, we don't want that.
Well, Charlie, Sarah has another opening for an
Yes.
avenue to psychic abilities. She wants to know about psychedelics.
Psychic and psychedelics. Many years ago, it's hard to believe this was more than 50 years ago for me. I was one of the very few people in the West who had a psychedelic experience. I had read a book by Aldous Huxley called The Doors of Perception, which I would still recommend as one of the best books on psychedelics ever written. And he was writing about his mescaline experiences. I then met a visiting psychologist, a European from Austria, who had done some experiments with giving mescaline to people in Europe. And after we talked about many things of mutual interest, he mentioned that he had never heard of any experiments at which an American had been given a psychedelic. I said, I'll volunteer. I read this book and it sounds pretty good. So one Saturday morning, first there was the sacrifice to be made. I had to skip breakfast. That was a big sacrifice for me at that time in my life. I went to this laboratory where we did not ask permission to do this experiment because it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. And he gave me what I now realize was a quite strong dose of chemically pure mescaline sulfate. I made the sacrifice of drinking this stuff dissolved in water, and it tastes like lukewarm vomit. But, this was for science and spirituality or something like that, so I had to do it. And then we sat around. My wife was with me, a couple of other friends, and the visiting psychologist, waiting to see what happened to an American. And we waited a long time. And I think he was about deciding that there's something different about Americans. Psychedelics like mescaline have no effect on them. I was very disappointed. I said, well, if I press on my closed eyelids, the little flashes are slightly brighter. I don't think that's a psychedelic experience. So he said, okay, we can call it a day and you can go home, or I can give you some more. So he gave me another 100 milligrams of mescaline sulfate. So my dose was now 500 milligrams, which I think is pretty substantial. And nothing happened until all of a sudden I went from being perfectly straight to the peak of the psychedelic experience. It's been more than 50 years, but I still smile when I think of that. wish I could find the notes I made on what it was like there. But again, a lot of it was state-specific knowledge. When I was a subject in a psychiatrist's experiments later on with various psychedelics, I understood some of the stuff that had happened in the mescaline experiment, but it doesn't translate into my ordinary consciousness. I was very glad that I had read Aldous Huxley's book, because the set I went into the experience with, and I think you all know that set and setting is really important on affecting what a psychedelic does. The set he gave me was kind of a scholarly scientific setting with the spirituality there, but low played. If it had given to me 10 years earlier, when I was hardly out of my teens and I was still going to church, I might have become a minister after God showed me that stuff, but it didn't work out that way. But I felt that I had some personal glimpses of what the mystics had talked about. And that was really something. I have to tell you another story on that. There was a lot of stuff in the academic and psychological literature back then about, do psychedelics actually produce a genuine mystical experience? And immediately, of course, you'll say, how do you define a genuine mystical experience? Well, it's something a mystic had. But what amazed me is that almost all of the arguments were between three kinds of pairs of people. One had had a psychedelic and the other one hadn't. One had had a spontaneous mystical experience and the other hadn't, or neither had had. So I thought, how can people, when at best only half of them have any personal experiences of what in the world they're talking about, try to decide which one is more, which one is the same? Years later, I met what was his professional thing? He was a doctor, he was an anesthetist, okay, who had had a spontaneous mystical experience, very much like Huxley had had. And before that, he had never heard of mystical experiences. Mystical schmystical, what's all that nonsense about? It just came on him and it changed his whole life. He was then curious enough, a year or so later, to hear all this talk about psychedelics, to get a psychedelic and take it to see from the inside whether it was the same. He said the psychedelic experience was very good, but it wasn't the same. I persuaded him to write this up. We published a joint article on it. If you look up Smith and Tart or something like that, or it's on my archival website where most of my journal articles are. He gave some excellent comparisons from the inside. Now, of course, we need a lot of those kinds of things. The set and setting you take in is so much more important. Probably, if I used to kid researchers that if all you know is that somebody had X milligrams or micrograms of such and such a chemical, you know very little about them except that they probably had something unusual happen. But if you begin to know something about their personality, their expectations, and so forth, then you have a chance of greater understanding of what they experienced. Does that do it? There's a million more things I could say, but.
Okay, Lynn has a question.
Oh, my daughter has just tuned in and she's posted a note, my father's website. Okay, if you can't copy that down, because I think the chat box disappears at the end of things, if you just put Charles Tart into the web, it'll give you a link to my website quickly. Okay, Sarah, were you getting ready to say something? Virginia was, somebody was.
She had just asked me to speak.
Sure. I'm waiting for somebody to speak. I'm confused now.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wrote my dissertation on Aldous Huxley back in 1974. And
Really?
I never got to meet him in person, but I
Ah,
read all of his 69 full-length books, and ended up writing about especially about how Island, his last book, was an answer to Point Counterpoint and all those other early satires and stuff. And so anyway, I'm glad that about that. What I loved about that was that in Island, it was the kids went and did climbing stuff and really put themselves actually in danger and exerted themselves. And then they came back and had the LSD. But I felt when I was writing that dissertation that I really communed. So I wrote it at 74 and 70. I mean, I finished it in 74. So some of the time I was writing and he was still alive. And sometimes I would ask him a question and I would go to a book and I'd open up a page and there was his answer, because I really looked to him as a kind of spiritual mentor at that point.
mhm.
And I used to feel as if I was pretty intuitive in that way. And then I eventually moved into the Kripalu Yoga Ashram in Massachusetts. And I feel as if I lost all of that. You would think it would have given me more, but it felt as if it kind of it out. And so I've been wondering how to get some of that back, because I enjoyed that. I still most of the time can tell who's calling me. I almost always know who it is who's calling me. Or maybe I just thought about them and they call me, or I'm just thinking about calling them and they call me. But beyond that, I feel as if I used to have much more interesting insights than I do now. Do you have any ideas about how to cultivate that again?
Yeah, I never got to meet Aldous Huxley either. I wish I had. I knew people who knew Aldous Huxley, people who knew his wife and so forth. Usually a connection through Essel and something like that. And I would have loved to have met him, but no such luck. Is your dissertation published?
No, it's sitting in the USC library.
Oh, is it digitized? I'd like to read it.
Oh, thank you. Well, I've been wanting to have a reason to digitize it. So I think I'll call them and ask them, and
Great.
thank you.
Well,
Yeah.
tell him a distinguished researcher wants to read it and he can only read digital, where he can blow the print up to a good size.
Okay.
In terms of your question, that's too tough a question.
Okay.
I mean, essentially you're asking me, what kind of spiritual paths can one go on and what kind of effects do they have?
No,
And
I think I'm just asking more, how do you, see, I have a feeling that it's being open to intuition in a way that I'm not anymore, but I was before.
okay, here's what I'd say to that. People often ask me about psychic readings they've gotten. And I'm trying to write a final book, and the kind of thing I want to say about that is this. There are two major approaches you can take to material that's supposed to be psychic. That can be something that somebody's channeled, or some people make a practice of open books at random and go halfway down the page and pay good attention to what it says there and so forth. If you get some kind of psychic reading, one approach you can take is to say, is it really psychic? Does it produce information that I could not have known through any normal channels? That's the research thing, and that's what's been focused on for the past 100 years and the like. But there's another approach, which I think is more practical. And it's one I take sometimes, in which I simply say, I'm going to assume that the way I open this book, or the tarot cards I deal out, or something like that, I'm going to assume it has something of importance for me, and I'm going to use that to stimulate my own creative juices. I'm not going to worry about where it came from. Is it my subconscious? I knew one of the world's most famous mediums, Eileen Garrett. She gave me my first research grant through her foundation, as a matter of fact. But anyway, she had been channeling various spirits, not only of people who died, but spirit guides and the like throughout her whole life. And she had worked with a lot of psychologists who wanted to know, how does her mind work? And one of the things some of the psychologists came up with was, well, it's just her unconscious mind, her unconscious mind is imitating this deceased person, or Abdul Latif is one of her spirit's guide or something like that. And occasionally your unconscious mind uses ESP to throw in something that she couldn't have known normally. So that makes it impressive. So they pay more attention. And when she was asked about that toward the end of her life, she said, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I think I do what I think I do. I channel spirit beings. On Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, I think the psychologists are right. It's all my unconscious mind. And on Sunday, I try not to think about the damn stuff. I thought that was a very sensible approach. Sort of, if play with your intuition. Don't take it too terribly seriously, because I think playfulness helps. And laboratories don't usually encourage playfulness, unfortunately.
Thank you.
Okay.
Joe has his hand raised.
Well, Sarah was channeling the same thing the question that I had. Over 50 years ago, I read this book by a Russian mathematician, Uspensky.
Oh, P.D. Uspensky,
Yeah, I was quite intrigued with it. And as I recall, it's been 50 years since I read this book. I just seemed to be,
Morganum.
yeah.
I think I tried it and couldn't make it, but
I got through part of it, I think.
He's got another book which was very much about Gurdjieff's system that he learned from Gurdjieff. It's much more readable than Tertium Organum. He was, I don't know, he's often a mathematical wonderland or something like that. I gave up. But go on, Joe, with your.
Well, it was just that he was speculating on it would correspond to the fourth dimension in his thoughts. And we had length, height, and width as the three dimensions, and the fourth dimension was that of intuition. And he was writing this not long after Einstein had his own, of course, theory about relativity and space-time being it. I just wondered if you had any further comments on it, or is anybody taking this work seriously anymore? Has there been further developments?
There are organized groups who study Gurdjieff's material, but they're kind of secretive and they don't really publish their results, okay? You have to find them in order to be taught how to do this mindfulness exercise that I talked about before. And Uspensky was one of Gurdjieff's main followers for many years, and eventually they had some kind of argument and broke up. Didn't have anything to do with each other anymore, except Uspensky kept teaching Gurdjieff's system. What's the name of Uspensky's book on Gurdjieff's stuff? It'll come to me eventually. But as far as fourth dimension, fifth dimension, sixth dimension, I read New Scientist and I read about what various physicists are saying, and we're in a brain, or I don't get it.
It's called In Search of Miracles.
In Search of the Miraculous. Yes.
Miraculous, yeah.
In Search of the Miraculous, yes. I recommend it highly if you're interested in becoming more aware. And that can cut down some of your suffering too, because when you see some of the silly things you do to make yourself suffer, you give them up. No guarantees though.
I can ask one more question then until somebody else raises their hand. What do the critics say? What is their main criticism of everything you've talked about today?
What does who say?
What do the skeptics say to anything that you've talked about?
Okay, I greatly honor genuine skeptics. Okay, and I'll define a skeptic as someone who says, we have an explanation for some certain phenomena, and it's pretty good, but I don't think it's complete, or I think there's a flaw in it, and I'm open to seeing new things about it. Okay, and I search for new kinds of knowledge. Any good scientist is a skeptic. Okay, you know, yeah, this theory works real well under these conditions, but what about under those conditions and whatnot? Almost all of the criticism of parapsychological research has come from people I have to call pseudo-skeptics, because they're not seeking to find out the real truth of what goes on. They won't read the experimental literature. A friend of mine was on a panel with one of these chief skeptics and he did the usual pseudo-skeptic thing of, oh, it's all errors and the statistics are wrong and people are deluding themselves or blah, blah. And my colleague, one of the physicists who's now done remote viewing stuff for a long time, said, let's not talk in vague generalities and so forth. Let me just start. Let's talk about a specific recent experiment, and you tell me what's wrong with that makes you skeptical of it. And the pseudo-skeptic stands up and says, you don't think I waste my time reading that crap, do you? And walks off the stage. That's a skeptic. That's a fanatic. That's someone who's got the truth, you know. When you won't look at evidence that doesn't fit in with what you want to believe, it may make you feel better. Some people may have to be that tight to kind of hold themselves together, but that's not science. That's a travesty of science. I wish it wasn't that way. There has been criticism in parapsychology over the years that has resulted in changes in experimental methods. And almost all of it has come from the working parapsychologists who actually see what the data looks like and what the methodology looks like. It's not by these people who say it's all crap, we won't waste our time dealing with it. It's sad. It's sad.
Some other questions?
Alan,
Babies.
babies?
Babies are pre-logical.
Ah, babies. Okay.
Our little babies.
Yeah.
We learn pre-logic. We learn the comfort of the unknown first.
Yeah.
And then we find occasion in the rest of our lives to go there because it's easier, it's more comforting than believing in anything, science, for example,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
we can't believe in, because in implies impossibility.
Yeah. I know
Right.
I've told people about their over-attachment to their belief systems. And then once in a while, somebody asks me, are you willing to accept the fact that this thing you believe may not be true and look at other things? I say, oh, but there's evidence for this particular. Well, yeah, I guess I'm being pretty rigid, aren't I? Maybe I better take a look at that, except for precognition. I'm not going to try to figure that stuff out. But you're right, people get very, very attached to their belief systems. It's a comfort.
Because it serves a function. It
Yeah.
justifies that belief. It
Yeah.
justifies the comfort that they will get from the baby
Mhm.
learned. I mean, it's just not only babies, it's children, it's Mickey Mouse, it is
Yeah.
all of the fantasy that we are fed and we just eat
Mhm.
and digest and store in our brains.
Yes. And we're
And that's why
subjected.
that's why people won't vaccinate.
Yeah. People make money out of selling us things. And to do that, they try to make us dissatisfied with what we have, to make us think their product is is new and will provide happiness and so forth. But they're playing on that need for comfort, for safety.
That's right. But cavemen didn't think comfort. They didn't cook their food either, but that's another separate issue.
Yeah.
Survival is the, and not antithesis exactly, but the other side of the pleasure and comfort side. But
You talking about survival after death or physical survival?
no, I'm talking about physical survival.
Yeah.
That we are constantly doing things, or were farming. 90% of whatever, some huge percentage of people spent their energies in making food, which they needed for survival. And when that became unnecessary, 19th century and industrial revolution, communications revolution, they're around now. What are they doing with the 90% of their time, other than complaining that they are overeating or oversized? But those are some results. But I'm saying that we learned it as babies and never unlearn it, and won't admit it. There's another proverb that says, if you see it, you lose it. We all can put in things there.
If you see it, you lose it.
In other words, not being able to see something allows you to believe it.
Ah. Well, I can apply that to my feeling about the possibility of survival after death. I can
Okay.
say, through having studied it, there's a fair amount of interesting evidence that says we might survive death. On the other hand, and I'll allow myself to believe that sometimes, because if it's not true and consciousness ceases when I die, I'm not going to be embarrassed. I'm not going to know I'm wrong. So
Well,
I
if you
just
write,
find the idea of survival more interesting.
yeah, if you write it and people read it, your memory can be embarrassed. But I guess I am old enough. I guess I stopped thinking about that. But
Okay.
that's the main purpose of my question was, a comment was to get the original illogical but comforting child origin of this. And then we teach, of course, these images, these illogics in many forms, including religion, which is taboo in certain areas. You can't say well, I've said enough.
Yeah. Things are rough. Any other questions?
Any
Have we
other
run
questions?
over time?
Flexible.
No, we haven't gone over. We're open for any other questions. I'll open it up here for anything else that anybody might want to say. Well, in that case, Charley, thank you for the last hour and a half of your time. Really appreciate it. This is fascinating stuff. And bravo. Come talk to us again someday.
And thank you guys for a lot of very interesting questions. I like questions that make me think about this stuff in different ways.
Okay. Well, again, thank you very much. And
okay.
You're the best, Charley. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Charlie. Love the humor you bring to this very deep subject.
Okay.